The bucket hit the dirt before Maude Prescott's knees did. She caught herself on her palms, rocks biting into flesh that had already been bitten 100 times this season, and she did not make a sound. She had learned not to make sounds. Sounds in Caldwell Creek, New Mexico Territory in the summer of 1882 were either threats or invitations, and she was neither equipped to threaten nor willing to invite anything that this town currently had to offer. The water spread into the red earth like a bloodstain, soaking away, taking with it everything she had spent the last 40 minutes hauling up the eastern slope from the creek bed below. 40 minutes of burning calves and a rope-burned right hand, and the absolute private humiliation of knowing that her neighbors had watched from behind sun-faded curtains and done nothing. 40 minutes gone, and the bucket needed to go down again. She stood up. She did not dust herself off. There was no point. She simply picked up the rope handle, turned back toward the slope, and started walking, because if she stopped to feel the full weight of what her life had become in the 14 months since Thomas Prescott had ridden out of Caldwell Creek never to return, she would sit down in that red dirt and become part of the landscape. The slope was steeper than it looked. It always was. There was a trick to it, a geological cruelty, where the first 20 yards eased you into a false sense that the climb was manageable, and then the angle shifted, and every remaining step became a negotiation between your will and the earth's indifference. Her boots, the left one held together with a strip of latigo leather she had cut from a broken bridle, slipped on the shale 3/4 of the way up. She went sideways. The bucket swung out. The water she had just refilled sloshed toward the rim. And then there was a large, sun-darkened hand closing over the rope handle just above her own, and a voice that was not loud, not performative, not theatrical in any of the ways that men's voices in Caldwell Creek usually were when they decided to insert themselves into a woman's struggle. The voice said simply, "Move over." Not a question, not a command dressed up as a courtesy, not the particular tone men used when they wanted credit for what they were about to do. Just 2 words, utterly flat, carrying the specific weight of someone who understood exactly how much effort had already been spent on this hill and had no interest in making it worse. Maude Prescott looked up. The man standing beside her on that shale slope was wearing a 5-pointed star on his coat. A Marshal's badge, federal issue, the silver worn down to near brass at the points. He was looking not at her but at the top of the slope, calculating the remaining distance with the expression of someone who considered this kind of problem purely logistical. He was perhaps 35, dark hair going gray at the temples. A jaw that suggested he had been hit there more than once and had not particularly changed his behavior in response. He moved to the uphill side of the bucket. He took the weight of it without ceremony. And Maude, for the first time in 14 months, did not know what to do with help. That moment on the slope, that intersection of her exhaustion and his unannounced arrival, was where everything between them truly began, though neither of them would have used the word "began" for a long time afterward. To understand how they arrived at that particular shale slope on that particular scorched afternoon, you had to go back to the morning Charles Hawkins rode into Caldwell Creek, with a federal warrant folded in his breast pocket, and a reputation that had preceded him by approximately 3 days. Caldwell Creek sat at the edge of what locals called the disputed basin, a stretch of rangeland in southern New Mexico Territory where 3 cattle operations, a mining company, and the federal government had been making incompatible claims on water rights since the Railroad Survey of 1879. By 1882, those incompatible claims had produced 2 shootings, 1 arson, a territorial legislative inquiry that had resolved nothing, and the particular brand of low-grade civic terror that descended on small towns when the men with the most guns decided that the law was something that happened to other people. The man who had decided this most enthusiastically was a rancher named Gerald Holt. Gerald Holt owned the Broken Mesa operation, 4,000 acres of grazing land, and a sufficiently large number of hired hands that the word posse applied to his payroll as naturally as the word employees. He had been systematically cutting off water access to the smaller homesteads on the eastern slope of the basin for the better part of a year, and the territorial marshal's office, which was short-staffed and politically complicated and located a significant ride away in Santa Fe, had been slow to respond. Charles Hawkins was the response. He arrived on a Tuesday, which in Caldwell Creek meant the weekly supply wagon had just come through, and the general store run by a man named Elias Webb had a crowd. Hawkins tied his horse, a solid bay gelding named Declan, to the post outside the store and walked in and bought a tin of coffee and a box of sulfur matches and a length of rope. And he did these things with the economy of motion of a man who had been buying supplies in frontier towns for long enough that the transaction was purely mechanical. He had the kind of stillness that read as dangerous in a saloon and as simply competent anywhere else. He did not announce himself. He did not show his badge to anyone in the store. He paid Elias Webb in exact coin, collected his purchases, and walked back out into the Tuesday sun. It was Elias Webb who mentioned him to people afterward, saying he had the look of a federal man, and the word passed through Caldwell Creek in the way that significant words always pass through small isolated towns, which was fast and imprecise, and in all directions simultaneously. By Tuesday evening, Gerald Holt knew a marshal had arrived. By Tuesday evening, Maude Prescott did not know and would not have particularly cared, because she was dealing with the more immediate problem of her roof. The roof of the homestead that she and Thomas had built on the eastern slope 3 years earlier had developed a leak over the winter that had been manageable in the cold months and had become an emergency as the summer rains began. She had climbed up onto it twice, once in May and once in June, and made repairs with the tar paper and cedar shingles she had bought with the last of the cash she had from selling 2 of the dairy cows in April. Both times the repair had held for perhaps 2 weeks and then given way in a slightly different location, as if the roof were finding new creative outlets for its structural failure. She had no more money for shingles. She had no more cows to sell. She had her vegetable garden, her one remaining dairy cow named Pearl, her chickens, and the homestead itself, 160 acres of rough grazing land, and a creek-fed spring that she had not been able to fully access in 3 months because Gerald Holt's men had been diverting the water upstream at a point that Holt claimed was within his property boundary. The claim was legally dubious. The legal dubiousness had not, so far, produced any actual water. So she had been hauling from the main creek bed, which was below the diversion point and therefore still flowing, and that was why she was on the shale slope with a bucket twice a day, every day, in the July heat. She had asked for help twice, once from the town's justice of the peace, a man named Orville Cates who was broadly understood to be in Gerald Holt's financial orbit, once from a neighboring homesteader named Pete Garfield, who had expressed genuine sympathy and had then explained, with the particular defeated helplessness of a man who had already calculated his own risk, that he could not afford to put himself in Holt's sights. Maude Prescott understood. She did not forgive exactly. But she understood. What she did not understand, and what she spent a significant amount of the time she was not spending on the slope turning over in her mind, was whether Thomas Prescott had understood this too. Whether he had, in the weeks before he left, already made the calculations that Pete Garfield had made, already looked at Gerald Holt's operation and the town's established pattern of looking away, and decided that the arithmetic did not work in their favor. Whether his leaving had been cowardice dressed as practicality, or some darker betrayal she hadn't yet identified, or whether she was being unfair to a man who might be dead in a ditch somewhere for all she actually knew. No letter. No word through any traveler passing through. No indication at all, 14 months later, of what Thomas Prescott had become or where he had gone, except for the small and devastating evidence of everything he had left behind. She had put this into a private compartment in her mind, sealed it, and attended to the practical. This was how she had survived 14 months alone on a homestead in disputed territory with a leaking roof and a water problem. She was not, she had decided, going to let herself be destroyed by a man who had already gotten his leaving for free. She was, however, very tired. She was thinking about the tiredness specifically on the afternoon that Charles Hawkins appeared beside her on the slope, which was why she had slipped. Not from inattention, exactly, but from a moment of letting the tiredness be real instead of keeping it at a managed distance, and the shale had taken advantage. When he said, "Move over," and took the weight of the bucket, she did move over. Not because she was accustomed to being directed, but because the words had been offered without any of the particular freight that men's directives usually carried. No expectation in them. No implication that she had needed saving. Just the straightforward observation of a man who could take some of the weight and intended to. They climbed the last third of the slope in silence. He set the bucket down beside her front door with the same economical motion with which he seemed to do everything, and then he looked at the homestead with the assessing expression of someone who was cataloging what needed doing, and this irritated Maude considerably. "I don't require an inventory," she said. He looked at her. His eyes were a particular shade of dark gray, which she noticed and immediately put in the same sealed compartment as the Thomas Prescott question. "I wasn't making one," he said. "You were looking at the roof. It needs work. I am aware that it needs work. That's not a piece of information I require from a stranger." He had the decency not to argue the point. He reached into his coat and produced his badge, not with any flourish but simply to answer the logical question of who he was. "Charles Hawkins," he said, "Federal Marshal. I'm in Caldwell Creek on a water rights matter." Maude looked at the badge. She looked at him. 14 months of doing everything herself had made her a very accurate reader of what people intended when they presented themselves to her. And what she read in Charles Hawkins was not a man looking for gratitude or authority or anything that he planned to collect later. What she read was, somewhat to her surprise, simple professional directness. "Gerald Holt," she said, and it was not a question. Among related matters, he picked up his hat which had come off during the climb and resettled it. "I'd like to speak to the residents of the eastern slope about the water diversion. You're the third homestead I've approached today. The other two asked me to leave. Because they're afraid of Gerald Holt." "Yes. Are you going to tell me I shouldn't be afraid of Gerald Holt?" He considered this with what appeared to be genuine seriousness. "No," he said. "He has legitimate reasons to be afraid of. What I can tell you is that those reasons don't include what a federal court will do to his water diversion if I can establish the documented pattern of interference. That's a different calculation." Maude looked at him for a long moment. The July sun was still absolutely merciless overhead, and she had one more bucket to carry before the day's essential water supply was complete, and her palm was bleeding slightly where the shale had cut it on the way down. She was conscious of all of these things simultaneously, and she was also conscious of something else, which was the precise, unfamiliar sensation of someone treating her like a person whose judgment was worth consulting. "Come inside," she said. "I'll tell you what I know." What she knew was considerable. Over the following hour, seated at the rough-hewn table that Thomas had built their first winter here, with cups of coffee that represented a small luxury she could not quite bring herself to eliminate from her budget, Maude Prescott told Charles Hawkins everything she had observed about Gerald Holt's water operations over the preceding year. She told it in the particular precise way she had always processed information, in sequence, with dates she had written down in a small leather notebook, with the names of which hands had been at the diversion point on which occasions, with the measurements she had taken of the spring flow before and after the diversion using a tin cup, an account method she had devised herself. Hawkins listened. He took notes in a small leather-bound book of his own. He asked clarifying questions that were precise and never condescending, and when she had finished, he looked at her notes and said, "You've documented this better than the previous 3 complaints filed with the territorial office combined." I had reason to be thorough, Maude said. What made you stay? He asked. When your husband left. The question was direct enough that it might have been rude from another person. From Hawkins, it registered as genuine rather than intrusive, which annoyed her somewhat because she preferred to keep her reasons her own business. But she answered it honestly because she had decided, somewhere in the last hour, that honesty was what this man offered and what he therefore was owed in return. Because it's mine, she said. I broke this ground alongside him. I built the garden and managed the animals and hauled the water and negotiated with the supply wagon and kept the accounts. The fact that Thomas's name is on the land grant does not mean the land is not mine, and I am not going to let Gerald Holt or anyone else take it from me because I don't have a man's name to put in front of my own. Hawkins wrote something in his notebook. The 1862 Homestead Act allows female claimants in cases of abandonment, he said. You could file for transfer of the claim to your own name. I know that, Maude said, somewhat more sharply than she intended. I've been corresponding with the Territorial Land Office about it for 6 months. The process takes time and requires documentation that I'm working on acquiring. I can help expedite it. I have a contact at the land office in Santa Fe who handles exactly this kind of transfer. She looked at him again. There was a quality to Charles Hawkins that she was still trying to identify, a quality that was not the performed chivalry that she found exhausting, not the calculated generosity that expected to be paid back in a specific currency, not the particular paternalism that manifested as helpfulness while quietly suggesting she was incapable of managing her own affairs. It was something more like the competence of a colleague recognizing another colleague's problem and offering a relevant tool. She did not trust it entirely. She had learned not to trust competent men entirely. But she did not dismiss it either. I would appreciate that, she said. He stayed for another 30 minutes, asking questions about the other Eastern Slope residents, about the town's political structure, about what she knew of Holt's legal representation. He drank 2 cups of coffee and ate a piece of cornbread that she offered because it was the polite thing and not because she had much to spare. And then he stood up, put his notebook away, and said, in the same flat tone he seemed to use for everything, I'll need to speak with you again. There are some things I'd like to verify against the territorial records before we discuss next steps. You know where to find me, she said. On that slope, he said. It was not a joke exactly. It was an observation delivered with a very slight shift in expression that was not quite a smile but occupied the same region. Maude was careful not to register it. After he left, she sat at the table for a while in the particular quiet of the homestead in the late afternoon, with the sunlight going orange through the single west-facing window. And she put her palms flat on the table and felt the texture of the wood that Thomas had planed and she had sanded. And she thought about the fact that, for the first time in a very long time, someone had come to her door with something that felt like an actual plan. She did not let herself feel hope. Hope was a luxury that had specific costs in her current situation, but she did not prevent herself from feeling something slightly warmer than pure pragmatism, which was, she told herself, a different thing entirely. She was wrong about that, but she did not know it yet. Charles Hawkins had arrived in Caldwell Creek carrying 2 things in addition to the federal warrant. One was a personal history in the territory that stretched back to 1873, when he had served as a deputy in the Cimarron area during the years of the Colfax County War, a sustained brutal conflict over land and water and political power that had killed a number of men he had respected and confirmed everything he already suspected about what happened when property rights became power contests without functional legal mediation. He had emerged from those years with a deep and specific conviction about the relationship between documented legal process and human safety, and with a scar along his left forearm that he no longer thought about most of the time. The other thing he carried was a question he had not yet answered about what came next for him, professionally and otherwise. He was 36 years old. He had been a federal marshal since 1876, appointed under the reform push following the chaos of the Grant administration years, and he was good at the work, technically accomplished at it, and he had felt the specific hollowness of technical accomplishment for long enough that it had stopped surprising him, and had started simply residing in his chest like weather. He had not been looking for anything in Caldwell Creek except the resolution of a specific federal case. He had not been looking for a woman who kept a precise notebook of water flow measurements and told him with complete directness that she intended to keep what was hers. He had definitely not been looking for the particular sensation he had felt on that shale slope, which was not heroism or gallantry or anything from the register of performed masculinity, but something more basic, the sight of someone carrying more than their share alone, and the uncomplicated animal instinct to go stand beside them. He thought about this more than he intended to over the next several days. The investigation required multiple visits to the eastern slope. Maude Prescott was, as she had indicated she would be, exactly where he could find her, maintaining the homestead with the focused efficiency of someone who had stripped all wasted motion from her routines and kept only what was essential. When he came by on Thursday, she was mending a fence line. On Saturday, she was in the garden, which was producing remarkably well for a drought year, evidence of careful water management that underscored everything she had told him about her creek measurements. On the following Tuesday, she was on the slope again, and this time he fell into step beside her without comment, and she moved over without comment, and they went up together with the shared weight of the bucket between them, and neither of them remarked on the fact that this had now become a pattern. He learned things about her in the spaces of those working conversations. That she was from Ohio originally, that she had come west at 22 with Thomas Prescott, whom she had married at 21 in the straightforward way of young people who believed that forward motion and shared ambition were equivalent to love. That she had liked New Mexico territory from the first moment she had seen it, the scale of it, the sky, the way the mountains changed color from morning to afternoon to evening in a visual sequence that Ohio, with its reasonable horizons, had not prepared her for. That she had a dry wit that appeared unexpectedly in the middle of entirely serious sentences and disappeared just as quickly, as if she was still deciding whether humor was something she could afford. She was 27. He noted this without making it mean anything, because he was committed to not making things mean what he suspected they were beginning to mean. She learned things about him in return. That he had been in the territory since 1873, that he had been stationed in Santa Fe for the past 4 years and found it somewhat bureaucratic for his preferences, that he had a bay gelding named Declan who was stubborn about stream crossings in a way that Hawkins spoke about with the patient affection of someone who had long since stopped expecting to change the horse's fundamental character. That he read more than people expected Marshals to read and kept a small supply of books in his saddlebag that he rotated through the territorial towns like a lending library. "What are you currently carrying?" she asked him on one of these exchanges, with the slight but unmistakable color of genuine curiosity. He produced, from the inside of his coat, a battered copy of a collection of natural history essays that he had acquired in Albuquerque. She looked at it with an expression that he had learned to read as the prelude to something interesting. "I have 2 books," she said. "I've read them each approximately 11 times. The supply wagon doesn't carry books. I'll leave this one when I'm done," he said. "You haven't offered it to the other homesteaders. The other homesteaders haven't asked." This exchange happened on a Wednesday afternoon, and it was the first thing in a very long time that made Maude Prescott laugh. Not a polite laugh, not a social performance of amusement, but the brief, genuine, involuntary thing, the real article. She recovered it quickly and looked away toward the garden with the focused expression she used when she was reestablishing professional distance, and Hawkins looked at the middle distance with a similar expression, and neither of them did anything about what had just happened. But it had happened. The investigation was advancing. Hawkins had been building a systematic case against Holt's water diversion, cross-referencing Maude's careful notes with the territorial land surveys, with the recorded water rights claims, and with the testimony he was slowly and carefully collecting from the other Eastern Slope residents, who were beginning to talk once word spread, through the particular informal telegraph of isolated communities, that the federal marshal was patient and specific, and not, apparently, in Gerald Holt's pocket. Holt was aware of all of this. Holt's awareness manifested in the way that powerful men's awareness usually manifested in this territory in 1882, which was through proxies rather than directly, through the delivery of pressures that were difficult to document but impossible to misread. On a Saturday in late July, Maude found her fence line cut. Not broken, cut with wire cutters, deliberately and at multiple points. Her cattle, all 2 remaining of them, had gotten into a neighbor's unfenced land and had to be retrieved with apologies and the expenditure of social credit she could not afford to spend. She fixed the fence herself. She did not mention it to Hawkins on his next visit because she was not in the habit of listing her troubles to anyone, and she had also decided, in the privacy of her own reasoning, that she was not going to become the kind of woman who cataloged her suffering for a man to manage on her behalf, regardless of how functional and respectful that man appeared to be. Hawkins found out anyway because in a town the size of Caldwell Creek, information moved, and because he was specifically trained to notice when the pattern of harassment directed at a witness changed in nature. He came by on a Monday and said without preamble, "I heard about your fence." "It's repaired," she said. "That's not the point. I understand that. The point is that Gerald Holt wants me to feel precarious. I am aware that I am precarious. The difference is whether I let the awareness perform itself in ways that benefit him." She was hanging laundry on the line strung between the corner of the house and a post she had driven herself, and she did not stop doing this while she spoke. "What I need from you is not protection. What I need is for the legal case to move quickly enough that his cost-benefit calculation changes." Hawkins was quiet for a moment. "You've thought this through precisely," he said. "I think everything through precisely. It's one of my primary coping mechanisms." There was a pause. "I'm filing the water rights injunction this week," he said. "I've got enough documented to request a temporary halt to the diversion while the case is heard. That means you'll have water from your spring again within 10 days to 2 weeks, assuming the circuit judge in Las Cruces handles it without delays." Maude stopped with a sheet half pinned and turned to look at him. 10 days, she said, "possibly 2 weeks. And the land title transfer to my name. I wrote to Santa Fe last week. You should have a response within the month. The federal contact I mentioned will prioritize it." She finished pinning the sheet. She was aware of something happening in her chest that was dangerously close to relief. And relief, she had learned, was vulnerable in the way that hope was vulnerable, which was that it opened things that had been closed for the specific reason of keeping you functional. She was not sure she wanted to be opened right now, with laundry on the line and a fence she had just repaired and the Marshal of Caldwell Creek standing in her yard looking at her with that expression she had not quite decoded, the one that was too steady to be casual and too quiet to be something she could easily name. "Thank you," she said. "You documented the case," he said. "I'm filing the paperwork." "That's the division of labor." "Charles," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name rather than his title, which she had done entirely without planning to, and she registered this fact at exactly the same moment that he appeared to register it, from the specific small alteration in his expression. She was not going to manage anything about this with grace, she realized. The thing that was happening, and it was happening at the worst possible time, in the middle of a legal case where she was a witness, and he was the investigating officer. And she was a woman whose husband had not technically divorced her but had also not been seen in 14 months, and he was a federal marshal with a job that took him elsewhere by definition. She was cataloging these complications with the same precision she applied to water flow measurements, and she was aware that the catalog was not actually preventing anything. "I'll have updates by the end of the week," Hawkins said, in the tone of a man who was also executing some kind of management strategy. He left before either of them could make it worse. He came back on Wednesday, not for official reasons, or not entirely. He brought the natural history book, which he had finished, and a second one he had acquired from the supply wagon's incidental stock, a thin volume on practical astronomy that he thought might appeal to someone who had mentioned, in passing, that she often sat outside in the evenings because the homestead was cooler outside than in. He also brought a proper bundle of cedar shingles that he had purchased from a man on the north end of town who was tearing down an outbuilding. Maude looked at the shingles and said nothing for a moment. "You said the roof needed work," he said. "I said I was aware the roof needed work. Those were almost precisely my words. The shingles were available, it seemed practical. You bought roof shingles for me. I bought roof shingles that I had some expectation of helping apply," he said. "I've done it before. It's not a complicated job with 2 people. What followed was 2 hours of roof repair that was, objectively speaking, the most companionable time Maude Prescott had spent in 14 months. He climbed up with the tools and the shingles without drama. She came up the other side with the tar brush. They worked from opposite ends of the damaged section toward the middle, and they talked while they worked, the same quality of conversation they had been having during the water carries and the fence inspections and the coffee meetings, which was honest and sometimes funny, and entirely without the performance layer that she had previously believed was simply the universal cost of human interaction. She told him about Ohio. He told her about arriving in New Mexico territory at 25, about the Cimarron years, about the particular education in what law actually meant and didn't mean when the men who held the guns decided they were the law. She told him about the night she had been alone in the homestead during a thunderstorm in the winter and had decided, with complete clarity, that she was not leaving, that whatever happened she was staying, and that this had been a kind of freedom she had not expected. He told her about a night in 1876 when he had made a different decision, one he still considered most nights, not because it had been wrong exactly but because it had been irrevocable, and the understanding that certain choices could not be unmade was something he was still negotiating. He did not tell her what the decision was. She did not ask. They came down from the roof at the same time, from opposite sides of the ladder he had borrowed from her shed, and they met on the ground at the corner of the house at the same moment, and there was a very small and absolute silence in which neither of them moved, and in which the distance between them was approximately 18 inches and fully aware of itself. "The books," he said. "Yes," she said. He produced them from where he had left them propped against the wall. She took them. Their hands did not touch in the transfer, which was a deliberate and entirely obvious choice on both parts. "I'll have news on the injunction by the end of the week," he said. "You already said that." "No," she looked at him. He looked back at her, 27 and 36, and the late afternoon sun turning everything amber and the roof newly patched above them, and the smell of tar paper and cedar and the specific desert smell of sun-warmed red earth that she had come to think of as the smell of her life. Everything she was managing in her chest was visible, she suspected, in her expression, and she watched him see it and manage the same visibility in his own. "Good night, Charles," she said. "Good night, Maude," he said. She went inside. She stood with her back against the closed door for exactly 10 seconds, and then she opened the practical astronomy book and read for 45 minutes, and did not think about him at all, except continuously. The injunction came through in 9 days, faster than expected. Charles had filed with a specificity and urgency that had moved the circuit judge, combined with Maude's documented evidence, which the judge had found notably compelling in its precision. Gerald Holt was ordered to cease the water diversion at the upstream point with immediate effect, pending the full water rights hearing scheduled for September. The day the water came back through the spring, Maude stood at the trough behind the house and watched it fill, and Pearl the dairy cow stood beside her with the complacent expression of a cow who had always known the water would come back, because cows did not understand the concept of bureaucratic uncertainty. And Maude Prescott put her hands in the running water and felt the cold of it and said nothing. But her throat was very tight, and her eyes were doing something she was strictly refusing to honor as crying. She heard hoofbeats on the path to the house. She composed herself before she turned around. Hawkins was coming up the path on Declan, who had apparently decided the path was acceptable and would not stubbornly refuse it the way he refused stream crossings. Hawkins pulled up and looked at the spring, at the trough, at Pearl, at Maude. "I see it worked," he said. "I'm currently standing in empirical evidence that it worked," she said. "How does it feel?" This was the kind of question that he asked with the particular quality that made her honest when she preferred not to be. "Like something I should have been able to do myself," she said, "and also like the first good thing in a very long time, both simultaneously." He got down from the horse. He tied Declan to the post by the shed, and the horse immediately began investigating the post with his nose in the expression of a horse conducting a formal inspection. Hawkins leaned on the trough rail and looked at the running water. "The hearing in September is the permanent resolution," he said. "Holt's lawyers will contest, but the documented pattern combined with the survey records should hold. You'll keep the water rights. And the land title transfer should arrive within the next 2 to 3 weeks, certified in your name alone." Maude looked at the water running into the trough. "And then?" she asked. She meant what happened to the case. She also, and this was the problem, meant something else, and they both knew it. "Then my assignment here is complete," he said. "You go back to Santa Fe." "That was the plan." She looked at him. "Is it still the plan?" The directness of this made something move in his expression, something that she had been watching accumulate over the past 3 weeks, and that now arrived at some kind of forward edge. He was quiet for long enough that she thought she had made a significant error in asking it, and she was preparing her internal response to that error, which was going to involve a great deal of dignity and the immediate discussion of something entirely unrelated. "No," he said. "It's not still the plan." She had been very controlled for 14 months. She had been contained and efficient and self-sufficient, and she had not let herself crack or soften or want things she could not have. She was aware that cracking now in front of the trough with Pearl investigating the situation with mild bovine interest was both dramatically imperfect and entirely outside her management. "Charles," she said. "I know the complications," he said. "Your husband's status. The case. I've been cataloging them every night for 3 weeks. I want to be honest with you about that." "I've been doing the same thing," she said. "The case is functionally concluded for my purposes. The hearing in September is documentation filing, not investigation. I don't need to be a witness or a participant. The complications of my official capacity are resolved." He paused. "Your husband is a separate matter, a practical and legal one. I know. I've contacted a lawyer in Santa Fe about establishing legal abandonment. It takes time." She paused. "I've been doing that since April." He looked at her. "April. I told you, I think things through precisely. I didn't know why I was thinking it through in April. I had some suspicion by May. By June it was relatively clear." "By June," he said, and his voice had changed slightly, the way it did when something moved him past professional stillness into something more personal, which she had only seen twice before and had catalogued carefully both times. "You hadn't arrived yet in June," she said. "So that's either optimistic long-range planning or deeply embarrassing revelation of prior hope." "I arrived in July," he said. "I noticed." He moved from the trough to where she was standing in approximately 2 steps, which closed a distance that had been too large for 3 weeks, and he was not impulsive about it. Nothing about him was impulsive. He was the same man who said, "Move over," instead of a speech. And what he did was simply take her hands and hold them in his in the straightforward way of someone who has decided that this is both the right thing and the thing they intend to do about it. Her hands were rough from the work. His were rougher. This was somehow the most right thing about the moment. "When the legal complications are resolved," he said. "Yes," she said, "and when you're ready, on your own terms." Not mine. She looked up at him. The sun was behind his shoulder, and the sky above the eastern slope was the particular deep blue of late afternoon New Mexico, the color she had tried to describe to her mother in Ohio in letters and had never adequately succeeded. "I've been ready for a long time," she said. "I've been waiting for circumstances to be ready." He held her hands and looked at her, and the expression on his face was the one she had been unable to decode from the beginning, and she understood it now because she was feeling the same thing herself, which was not the performed softness of romantic convention but something simpler and more durable. The recognition of a person who made sense, who made the specific sense that you had privately given up expecting to find. He did not kiss her. That came later. What happened on that afternoon at the trough was something more foundational, which was a mutual acknowledgement without pretense, and this was consistent with who they both were, and was for that reason entirely appropriate. Gerald Holt's response to the injunction came not through legal channels, but through the particular indirect pressure he had been applying for months, and it escalated. Within a week of the water flowing again, Maude found the feed shed door broken, the padlock cut. Nothing had been taken, which was the message being that they could take things, that the taking was entirely at their discretion. 2 days later, Pete Garfield, who had finally agreed to provide a statement for the September hearing, withdrew the statement with the white-faced, rigid expression of a man who had been told something he was not going to share. Hawkins was methodical about all of this. He documented each incident. He had a meeting with Gerald Holt that he did not describe to Maude in detail, but from which he returned with a new stillness that was colder than his usual stillness, and which told her the meeting had been informative in the way that conversations with men who had too much impunity were sometimes informative. "He threatened you," she said when he came by after. "He was careful about direct language," Hawkins said. "He's not a fool. He has a lawyer who has told him what can be cited in federal court. But the implication was clear enough. He's operating under the belief that my case collapses without your testimony and without the water monitoring records you've kept. He believes that sufficient pressure will cause you to withdraw from the proceedings." He paused. "He asked me to convey that he was willing to purchase the homestead at a generous price if you wanted to avoid the inconvenience of the legal proceedings." Maude was very still for a moment. Then she said, "What did you tell him?" "I told him that conveying property purchase offers was not within my official capacity and that he was welcome to make the offer himself." And a very slight shift in his expression. "And that my professional assessment was that the offer would not be accepted." Your professional assessment. It seemed like the appropriate framing for the conversation. She put her coffee cup down. "Charles, I'm not going to withdraw from the proceedings or sell the homestead or do anything else that lets Gerald Holt win. I want you to know that this is not something I need reassurance about. It is a settled determination." "I know that," he said. "I wasn't suggesting otherwise. I'm telling you about the conversation because you have the right to know what's being said about your own situation. That's respect, not doubt." She absorbed this. The distinction he was making was real and she received it as such. "What do we do about Pete Garfield?" "I'll try to speak with him again. Not to pressure him, he has the right to withdraw, but to see if there's a way to reduce whatever threat was made against him that I can document separately." He looked at his notebook. "You're still the primary documented witness. That's enough to proceed. I want you to know that your testimony alone, combined with your records, is legally sufficient for the September hearing." "I'm not worried about legally sufficient," she said. "I'm worried about Gerald Holt deciding that making an example of one woman on the eastern slope is worth the legal consequence." This was the closest she came to expressing fear to him, and she watched him receive it without minimizing it or overreacting to it, which was exactly the response she needed. "I'm going to increase my presence on this end of town for the next 3 weeks, he said. "Not in a way that makes you look protected, which I understand you don't want. in a way that makes it clear that any further incidents will be directly observed and documented by a federal officer. He paused. And I've sent a letter to the territorial governor's office outlining the pattern of interference with a federal investigation. Holt has political connections, but the territorial governor's office is currently under pressure about exactly this kind of land and water dispute. The political calculation is shifting. The September hearing approached in a kind of sustained tension that Maude managed by working, which was what she did with most things. She finished the roof repairs on the section Hawkins hadn't reached with the shingles. She winterized the garden, taking it earlier than necessary because the uncertainty of the situation made her want the tasks completed. She expanded the chicken coop with lumber she had traded for by doing the accounts of 3 neighboring homesteads, a skill she had never particularly advertised but which had quietly become a community resource. Hawkins was, as he had said, present on the east end of town. He stopped by the homestead most evenings, ostensibly because his rounds in the area made it a logical stopping point. The ostensibly became increasingly theoretical as the evenings grew longer, and the conversations moved from case logistics to the natural history book, and then to the astronomy book, which they went through together the way people go through things they want to slow down, taking longer than necessary over individual passages that provided an excuse to stay. She asked him, one evening in August, about the decision he had mentioned on the roof, the irrevocable one he still thought about. He was quiet long enough that she thought he was going to decline. "I had a chance to leave the Marshal's office in 1879, he said. "There was a position offered in Denver. Administrative, territorial law oversight, the kind of work that stays in one place. I had reasons to want to stay in one place at that time." He paused. "I didn't take it. The person who made staying in one place a reason was gone before the offer came through, and I made the decision based on who I had been before that, which was a man who moved, and I don't know whether it was the right decision for who I had become." He looked at the table. "I've been moving since 1873. At some point, moving stops being profession and starts being habit." "What was her name?" Maude asked. He looked up. "Catherine," he said. "She died of fever in the spring of 1879. We had been together 3 years. She was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," she said, with the full weight of the words, not the social version. "It was 4 years ago," he said. "I say that not to minimize it, but because I want you to understand that I'm not speaking from grief. I'm speaking from the subsequent question of what I did with myself after, which has been professional and solitary and has not, until recently, produced any desire to revisit the Denver option." "Is there a Denver option now?" she asked. "There could be a Caldwell Creek option," he said. "There's a resident marshal position available in the Basin District. I've been asked to consider it informally. The water rights cases have made the district a federal priority and they want someone permanent." Maude looked at him. She was fully aware of what was being said inside the logistics of what was being said. "You would stay," she said. "If there were a reason beyond the professional one," he said. "Yes." "Charles," she said, and this time the way she said his name had nothing professional in it at all. "Maude," he said, in exactly the same way. She crossed the distance between them at the table, which was 2 feet of rough-hewn Thomas Prescott timber, and she sat down beside him rather than across from him, which was the first time she had done this, and he turned toward her on the bench, and she took his face in her calloused hands and kissed him in the flat, deliberate way that was entirely consistent with how she did everything, without hedging, without the tentative approach, just the direct, honest thing. He kissed her back with equal directness and both hands came up to her shoulders, and it was not the romantic convention of the novels, which she had read 11 times each and which involved a great deal more atmospheric circumstance. What it was real, and in the way of real things it was better than the convention. They sat at the table for another hour in the specific altered quiet of people who have finally said a thing that has been building. And they talked about practical matters with the subtext of everything else running underneath. And when he left that night, She stood at the window for a while looking at the eastern sky, the way she sometimes did with the astronomy book beside her, and thought about the fact that she was 27 years old and had learned to carry everything uphill alone, and what it meant that she had been handed this very specific and particular option to not do that anymore, not because she could not carry the hill, but because someone had decided, without being asked, to stand on the uphill side. The September hearing was on a Tuesday. It was conducted in the town's small courthouse, a single room that also served as the justice of the peace's office, and on Sundays when the circuit preacher arrived, as a church. The circuit judge came from Las Cruces, a man named Aldrich who had a reputation for legal rigor that made Gerald Holt's lawyer, a Santa Fe man named Pemberton, notably careful in his language. Maude gave her testimony with the water monitoring records laid out in front of her, organized chronologically, with the flow measurements and the dates, and the observations of Holt's hands at the diversion point. She delivered it with the same flat precision she applied to everything, not performing distress, not performing courage, simply stating what she had observed and recorded, and the effect of this was that it sounded unassailably factual, because it was. Gerald Holt sat on the far side of the room with the expression of a man who had not expected the woman on the eastern slope to be quite this well-prepared. His lawyer filed the expected objections. Judge Aldrich overruled most of them with the economy of a man who had heard this class of objection many times. Hawkins provided the federal documentation, the territorial water rights survey, the land grant records, the series of incident reports he had filed over the preceding 8 weeks, and the signed statements from 4 Eastern Slope residents who had, ultimately, chosen to testify. Pete Garfield was not among them, but 4 others had decided that the shifting political calculation was sufficient protection. The judgment, delivered on Wednesday morning, held that Holt's upstream diversion constituted unlawful interference with established water rights under territorial statute and federal homestead provisions. He was ordered to permanently restore the original water flow, remove the diversion infrastructure, and pay a fine that the judgment described as proportional to the documented duration of the interference. His lawyer filed an immediate notice of appeal, which was his right, but the judgment also included a ruling that the existing injunction remained in force pending appeal, meaning the water kept flowing regardless. Maude walked out of the courthouse into the Tuesday sunlight and stood for a moment on the wooden sidewalk, and Charles Hawkins came out behind her and stood beside her, and the town went about its business around them, and she did not say anything for a long time. "It's not over," she finally said. "He'll appeal." "He'll lose the appeal," Hawkins said. "The documentation is what it is. An appellate court does not overturn established water rights on the basis of Holt's word against this record. But it takes time." "Yes, I'm very tired of things taking time," she said. "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "The resident Marshal appointment came through this morning. I received the official notification in the mail." She turned to look at him. "And I've accepted it." She took a breath. The sun was doing the New Mexico thing with the mountains, the mid-morning light that turned everything both hard and beautiful simultaneously, and she was standing on the sidewalk in Caldwell Creek in the dress she had mended 3 times and her one good pair of boots, which were not the pair with the Latigo repair, because she had finally replaced those with a pair from the saddler on the south end of town, purchased with the first money from the accounting work. And she was 27 years old, and the roof no longer leaked, and the water was running in the spring, and the man beside her had just told her he was staying. "Come to dinner tonight," she said. "Yes," he said. The abandonment proceeding for Thomas Prescott was filed formally in November of 1882, and the territorial court issued the final decree of legal abandonment in February of 1883. Which required 14 months of documented absence plus publication of notice and a waiting period. Maude's lawyer in Santa Fe, recommended by Hawkins through his territorial contacts, handled it with the efficiency of someone who had navigated this specific situation before. Because the frontier in 1882 produced a specific and not uncommon set of circumstances involving women left behind by men who had reconsidered their commitments to the hard work of staying. The land title transfer came through in October 1882, 3 weeks after the September hearing, and arrived as a certified document in a territorial land office envelope with Maude Evangeline Prescott listed as sole legal owner of 160 acres in the disputed basin area of the New Mexico Territory. She read it 3 times and then folded it precisely and put it in the small tin box where she kept the most important documents, and she did not cry, but she pressed her hands flat on the kitchen table again and felt the wood, and felt the whole weight of what it meant to have her name on a piece of land that she had broken herself to earn. She showed it to Hawkins that evening. He read it without comment and handed it back and looked at her with the full weight of understanding what it represented. And this was, she would think later, one of the most intimate moments they had yet shared, the wordless recognition of a hard-won thing. They were married in April of 1883. The wedding was conducted by the circuit preacher in the courthouse church on a Saturday morning that was clear and cold and very bright, with the desert smelling of creosote after a rain the night before. Maude wore the good blue dress she had spent part of the winter constructing from fabric she had ordered specifically through the supply wagon, blue wool serge with white collar and cuffs, made with the precise competence she applied to everything she decided to do. Hawkins wore his best coat and a white shirt, and had done something productive with his hair that she noted and did not remark upon. The witnesses were Elias Webb from the general store, who had warmed to both of them over the preceding months in the way of practical people who valued competence, and a woman named Rosa Banulos who had a homestead on the north end of the eastern slope, and who had become, over the preceding months, the closest thing Maude had to a friend in Caldwell Creek. Rosa had brought flowers from her winter garden, small bright things that were defiant against the late cold, and Maude held them and felt the luxury of the gesture. The ceremony was brief, and the words were traditional, and Maude said them with the same quality she brought to testimony, which was the quality of meaning precisely what she said. Hawkins said them looking at her, not at the preacher, which she noticed. Afterward, Rosa produced a bottle of wine from somewhere in her coat that made Elias Webb blink with surprise, and generated the first occasion on which Maude had seen Charles Hawkins laugh genuinely and freely, which was a laugh that she filed in the same place as his voice on the slope and his hands at the trough, and every other thing she had been collecting about him since July. They walked back to the homestead together in the late morning, and Declan was in the small corral beside Pearl, the 2 animals having arrived at a relationship of mutual indifference that was evidently sufficient for peaceful coexistence, and the creek was running in the spring below the slope, and the roof did not leak. "Mrs. Hawkins," Charles said, which was the first time either of them had used the name, testing it. "Maude Prescott Hawkins," she said, because she had decided this while mending the blue dress. "The Prescott is mine, I'm keeping it." "Of course," he said, "don't say of course as if it's obvious. Most men would require discussion. I'm not most men." "No," she said. "I specifically selected for that." He put his arm around her in the particular way he had developed, which was not the managing arm of someone guiding or redirecting, but simply the presence of another person choosing to be alongside, and she let herself lean into it the small amount that she was capable of leaning, which was more than she had managed with anyone in a very long time, and they walked up the path to the homestead in the April morning and went inside and closed the door. The spring and summer of 1883 were the most ordinary and the most extraordinary months of Maude Prescott Hawkins's life. Ordinary because the work of the homestead continued. The garden, the animals, the maintenance of the structures, the expanding accounting work that now covered 7 neighboring operations, and which she had begun to think of as a business rather than a sideline. Extraordinary because, for the first time, she was doing none of it alone, and the experience of not doing it alone was something she had to actively relearn, the recalibration of every habitual solo motion to account for another person present. Hawkins, in his capacity as resident marshal for the Basin District, kept his office in town, but spent the majority of his non-duty hours at the homestead. And this arrangement suited both of them in the way that practical arrangements suit practical people, which was that it worked without requiring extensive articulation. He was good at the things she was not instinctively good at, which included animal husbandry involving Declan's particular personality, the construction work that required significant upper body leverage, and the management of conflict with people in town who needed a calm and unmoved interlocutor rather than Maude's precise and sometimes unsparing directness. She was good at the things he was not instinctively good at, which included the domestic accounts and correspondence, the garden and food preservation, and the social navigation of the Eastern Slope community, where her standing had shifted considerably following the September hearing and the water rights victory. Holt's appeal proceeded through 1883 as expected, and in January of 1884, the Territorial Appellate Court upheld the original judgment in full. Gerald Holt paid his fine and removed the diversion infrastructure himself, or rather had it removed by his hands under the direct observation of Charles Hawkins, which was a scene that produced a specific satisfaction in Maude when Charles described it that evening at the kitchen table. "Did he say anything?" she asked. "He said several things. I've edited the most significant ones for mixed company. Charles, I am not mixed company." He produced the exact slight shift in expression. He said that he didn't understand why the territorial court was protecting a woman who couldn't keep her husband. Maude was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What did you say?" "I said that the territorial court was protecting documented legal property rights, and that his understanding of why would benefit from being wider." "That's restrained," she said. "I also filed a formal note in the official proceeding record documenting the statement as an example of the pattern of hostile behavior toward the claimant that had characterized the dispute from its beginning. So it's now in the permanent federal record." She looked at him across the table. "I do find your methods very effective," she said. "I learned documentation from a woman on the Eastern Slope," he said. The news that Maude was expecting a child came in the spring of 1884, and she received it in the same way she received all significant information, which was with an initial stillness, and then a systematic recalibration of what needed doing differently. She told Charles on a Tuesday evening when he came in from his rounds to find her sitting at the table with the same flat hands-on table posture he had come to understand as her processing position. He sat down across from her and waited, because he had learned this too. "We're going to need another room," she said. He understood immediately from her expression rather than the words what she meant. His face did something complex and genuine, and then settled into the warm stillness that she had come to recognize as his version of the thing she felt in her chest when she watched him with the animals or heard him reading aloud from the current book or turned to find him simply present in the room. "When?" he asked. "October, approximately." He reached across the table and covered her hands with his. "We'll build the room," he said. "I want it on the west side," she said. "The morning sun will hit the east wall and it'll be warm in the early hours." "West side," he agreed. She turned her hands over under his and held them. "Charles," she said, and this time the way she said his name had everything in it. The whole accumulated sum of the slope and the water and the injunction and the roof and the table and the testimony and the April morning and all the evenings since, pressed into 2 syllables. "I know," he said. They built the room through the summer of 1884, Charles doing the primary construction work on evenings and Sundays with help from Rosa Banulos's husband Miguel, who was a competent carpenter and who brought food and commentary in proportions that were both approximately equal and entirely welcome. Maude ran the accounts of the construction costs and managed the material acquisition, and did the interior finish work including the whitewashing of the walls, which she did on a Saturday in August while heavily enough pregnant that Charles stood below the ladder with an expression of concentrated anxiety that she found unreasonably endearing. "I'm whitewashing, not scaling the Rockies," she said from the ladder. "You are whitewashing while 8 months pregnant," he said, "which is not a distinction I find particularly reassuring. The walls need to be dry before October. I could whitewash the walls. You are not a thorough whitewasher. You missed 3 spots on the main room ceiling and I had to do them over." He said nothing, because this was accurate. "Come down from the ladder when you're done with that section," he said. "I'll come down when I'm done with this section and the next section," she said, and continued whitewashing, and he stood below the ladder with his arms at his sides in the posture of a man who has accepted that certain negotiations are closed. The child arrived in late October 1884, a boy, solid and loud and entirely uninterested in the drama of his arrival, except as a logistical matter. Rosa Banulos was present, having delivered most of the children on the eastern slope for the past 6 years, with a competence that made the theoretical availability of a proper physician in Las Cruces largely irrelevant as a practical concern. Charles was outside the closed door for the duration, in the specific suspended state of husbands in that era who had been firmly directed to be available but not present, and who managed this assignment with varying degrees of success. When Rosa opened the door and told him he could come in, he came in with the expression of someone who had been reevaluating his professional composure for several hours and had not entirely succeeded. And he sat on the edge of the bed and looked at Maude, who was tired in the most comprehensive sense of the word but entirely present, and holding a very new person wrapped in the yellow blanket she had spent the preceding month completing. And the way he looked at her in that moment was the particular look that she had decoded on the slope in July 1882 and had been receiving ever since, the look that was simply the undisguised fact of the thing. "He's well?" he asked. "He's very well," she said. "And you?" "I'm tired and extremely accomplished," she said. He bent forward and pressed his forehead very gently against hers, and they stayed that way for a moment with the baby making the small investigative sounds of the newly arrived, and Rosa made a diplomatic exit to see about the coffee, and the late October wind came off the mountains and the spring was running full and the roof did not leak. "What are we calling him?" Charles asked. They had discussed names during the summer months, lists and considerations, and the occasional disagreement that resolved into the pleasant negotiation of 2 people who were each accustomed to final authority and were learning to share it without loss of self. They had not arrived at a settled conclusion. Maude looked at the baby. She looked at Charles. She thought about a very specific summer morning in 1882 on a shale slope. "James," she said. "James Prescott Hawkins." He looked at her with the soft precision in his expression. "Prescott," he said. "It was always going to be part of the name," she said. "The land is Prescott Hawkins' land now. The name should reflect the whole of what it is." He said nothing for a long moment, and then he put his arm around her and she leaned into him the full amount, which was more than a small amount these days. And James Prescott Hawkins made a sound of mild inquiry about the immediate situation, and Maude looked at the west side window where the October sky was going purple over the mountains, and thought about everything she had carried uphill alone and everything she had decided to put down. Not because she could not carry it, but because the right person had come and said, without ceremony, "Move over." She had moved over. The Holt appeal's final dismissal came through in the spring of 1885, closing every legal thread of the water rights dispute permanently. Gerald Holt, facing both the legal loss and the political environment that had shifted considerably against the larger operations following several high-profile federal cases in the territory, sold the Broken Mesa operation in late 1885 and left the district. Maude noted this fact in her records with the same precision she applied to water flow measurements. The date, the relevant parties, the practical implication, which was that the eastern slope of the disputed basin was now a different place. James was walking by the time Gerald Holt left, a development he was pursuing with the focused determination that Maude recognized as a family trait, pulling himself along the kitchen furniture with the expression of someone who considered the transition to bipedal locomotion a logistical problem amenable to systematic effort. He had Charles's dark hair and Maude's particular quality of concentrated attention, and he considered the world from this combination of inherited characteristics with a seriousness that made Rosa Banulos say he would be a judge one day, which Maude thought was entirely possible. Charles's resident marshal role had expanded as the Basin District stabilized, and new settlements came in from the east. He was good at the work in the way he had always been good at the work, with the specific skill of a man who knew the difference between the law as written and the law as needed, and could navigate that gap without losing either the principle or the practical. He was also, Maude had observed, specifically good with the Eastern Slope residents, with the new homesteaders who arrived each spring, with the displaced and the uncertain, and the people who had come to the territory carrying difficult histories and needed someone in an official capacity who would deal with them without adding to the weight. She told him this on an evening in 1886, when James was asleep, and they were sitting on the front step in the August warmth with the sky going full dark, and the stars coming out with the particular extravagant density of the New Mexico high desert. And she had the practical astronomy book open, though she was not reading it. "You've become what you were trying to build in the Cimarron years," she said. He considered this. "That's a generous reading. It's an accurate reading. The Cimarron was about what law doesn't do. What you've been doing here is about what it does. The difference shows." He was quiet in the particular way that meant he was absorbing something he had not fully articulated to himself. "I couldn't have stayed in Santa Fe," he said. "The administrative work was removing me from the actual question." The actual question being whether the law protects the people who need it most. "Yes. The answer here is yes," she said. "Mostly with effort. With a great deal of effort," he said. She turned the astronomy book over in her hands. "James is going to ask about the stars soon," she said. "He's at the stage where he asks about everything." "He asked me today why the horse was sad," Charles said. "What did you tell him?" "I told him Declan wasn't sad, he was thinking." "That's diplomatically done," she said. "What was he actually doing?" "Standing there looking at the fence post again," Charles said. "I believe he's developed a philosophical relationship with that post." Maude laughed, the real laugh, the involuntary one, and Charles turned to look at her when she did because this was still, 4 years on, the thing that shifted something in his expression in the specific way that nothing else did. She was aware of this and found it still, after all the practical mornings and the long working days and the baby and the legal proceedings and the whitewashing arguments, the most extraordinary detail of her current life. The second child arrived in the winter of 1887. A girl this time, who came into the world with a very clear sense of her own importance and the vocal register to assert it. They named her Clara Frances Hawkins, Frances for Charles's mother, who had died when he was 19, and whom he spoke of rarely but with a specific tenderness that told Maude everything she needed to know about the shape of his early life. James received the news of Clara's arrival with the considered response of a 3-year-old conducting an assessment, and his verdict was that she made considerable noise and had taken up a quantity of his mother's attention, but that on balance he found her interesting, which Maude told Charles constituted the most analytical sibling reception she had witnessed. Clara was 2 months old when she first demonstrated a characteristic that would define her personality for the subsequent decades, which was a complete inability to accept the boundary conditions of any space she had been placed in. She worked her way to the edge of every blanket, every confined surface, every arrangement designed to contain her, with the focused experimental approach of an engineer testing structural limits. Maude watched this with the appreciation of someone who recognized a particular family trait manifesting in a new generation. "She's going to be difficult," Charles said, watching Clara execute a determined lateral roll that brought her to the exact edge of the folded quilt she had been placed on. "She's going to be very capable," Maude said. "The difficulty is temporary. The capability is permanent." He picked Clara up before she achieved the roll's logical conclusion, and the baby looked at him with the bright assessing expression she had for all new situations. "Frances," he said to her, because he called her this sometimes in the private register of the homestead, "the floor is not the objective." Clara considered this perspective and appeared to reject it. The homestead in the late 1880s had become a different place than the one Maude had maintained alone through the years of the dispute. The expanded room had been joined by a second addition in 1886, necessitated by the practical reality of a family that was growing and an accounting business that had developed sufficiently to require a dedicated space for records and correspondence. The garden was 3 times its original size and supplied not only the household, but contributed to a small regular market arrangement with Elia's Webb store that provided steady cash income. Pearl had been succeeded by 2 younger dairy cows of considerably more productive disposition. The chickens had multiplied to a number that Charles described, with technical accuracy, as a flock. Caldwell Creek itself had grown. The railroad's expansion through the territory had reached a junction point 18 miles south of the basin in 1886, and the resulting commercial activity had added perhaps 200 new residents to the area within 2 years. This brought the various opportunities and complications that accompanied growth in the territory, and Charles was navigating them with the methodical competence of a man who had been watching territories develop since 1873 and had developed calibrated expectations. It also brought in the spring of 1888 a complication that arrived in the form of a letter from Thomas Prescott. The letter came to the homestead, addressed to Maude Prescott, no Hawkins attached to the name. It had been forwarded through a postal office in Colorado. It was brief. Thomas had remarried in Colorado, apparently unaware that the legal abandonment proceeding had been completed years earlier, and that his remarriage was therefore technically bigamous, a problem that was his problem rather than Maude's, but which required documentation to resolve cleanly. He wrote to ask if she would agree to acknowledge the abandonment proceeding formally, which she had already done through the territorial court 4 years earlier. He also wrote, with the specific syntax of a man who had been thinking about something for a long time and was not quite able to say it directly, that he was sorry. Maude read the letter twice, with the flat hands on the table and the still expression of someone processing significant information. Then she showed it to Charles. He read it once. He put it down, he looked at the table. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said, and meant it. "The bigamy question is legally straightforward. I'll have the lawyer in Santa Fe send him a copy of the court documentation from 1883 and a letter confirming the proceeding. That resolves his Colorado situation. And the rest." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, James was making the sounds of a 5-year-old engaged in some outdoor project that probably involved Declan's fence post. "I spent a long time being angry at Thomas," she said. "Then I spent time trying to understand whether I should be angry or whether I should be fair. Then I was too busy to spend time on either." She looked at the letter. "He left. I don't know all the reasons, and I probably never will. He went and built another life, and apparently it's working for him. Hope it is. The anger I spent on him is mine, and I want it back. I've been doing other things with it since then." "Like what?" Charles asked. "Running a household and a business and a federal water rights case and raising 2 children," she said, "among other productive applications of intense energy." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not a dramatic gesture, just the familiar weight of it which she covered with her other hand. "I'll write back," she said, briefly, appropriately. "And then it's done." She wrote the letter that afternoon and sent it with the next supply wagon. She did not hear from Thomas Prescott again. The letter to the Santa Fe lawyer was filed and the documentation went to Colorado, and the bigamy question was resolved without complication, as cleanly as a well-maintained piece of legal machinery. She told Charles the following Sunday, when it was finished, "I want you to know that that's the last of it. Everything from before is settled." He looked at her across the breakfast table over the top of the newspaper he was reading, which had been arriving weekly from Las Cruces since the rail junction made it possible. "I know," he said. "You didn't seem particularly troubled by it. I wasn't. Most men would have been. You handled it," he said. "You've been handling things before I arrived and you handle things now. I trust your handling. The Thomas Prescott matter was yours to manage. You managed it." She looked at him. 41 and 31 and the morning light on the kitchen table, and the newspaper and James's voice from outside, and Clara asleep in the new room, and the spring running full in the creek. She had been awake the night before, in the particular way she sometimes was when things were good, not from anxiety but from the overflow of something she still did not have an entirely satisfactory word for. "Charles," she said. "Yes," he said, looking at his newspaper. "I love you," she said. It was not the first time she had said it. They had arrived at it the previous year in a specific private conversation that had been about 4 years of accumulated evidence and not about the word itself. But she said it now because the morning warranted it, and because she meant it at full volume. He put the newspaper down and looked at her with the full look, the one from the slope, the one from the trough, the one from every subsequent moment when the fact of her landed in him without management. "I love you," he said. James came in through the back door at that precise moment, face dirty, and with Declan's particular philosophical disposition confirmed by whatever had transpired at the fence post, and required immediate assistance in the matter of a splinter. And the domestic mourning reasserted itself in the cheerful and specific way of households with children. And Maude dealt with the splinter and the cleanup and the subsequent negotiation about whether James could have cornbread before midday. And Charles poured more coffee and returned to the newspaper, and Clara woke from the other room with the announcement of her awareness that the day was happening without her. It was entirely ordinary. It was everything. Maude Prescott Hawkins was 34 years old in the summer of 1889. Which was the year New Mexico Territory began the extended political conversation about statehood that would eventually, and not for another 22 years, produce a result. The Basin District had stabilized into a functioning agricultural and light commercial community, with a school that had opened in 1887, and to which James Prescott Hawkins went every weekday with the enthusiasm of a child, who had been waiting his entire conscious life for access to more books than the 2 on the homestead shelf plus whatever his father's saddlebag currently held. Clara was 2 and conducting her ongoing investigation of the world's structural limits with undiminished dedication. She had recently discovered that the stools in the kitchen could be moved to create a climbing infrastructure that extended her operational range considerably, and was methodically testing what this made accessible. Charles had been asked to consider the position of district supervisor for the Southern New Mexico Territorial Marshal's office, which would base him in Las Cruces and involve him in the broader administrative work he had stepped away from in 1882. He brought it home to the table the way they brought everything home to the table as a subject for the full conversation. "Las Cruces," Maude said. "It's the direction things are moving," he said. "The territorial reorganization ahead of the statehood discussion is going to require experienced oversight in the southern districts. The position matters." "It does," she said, "and you'd be good at it." "The homestead is established," he said. "Your accounting business has the structure to function if we relocated, or if you hired someone local to manage the daily operations while you continued the higher-level work. You've thought this through." "I've been thinking about it for 3 weeks." She looked at him. "Have you thought about whether you want it?" He paused. This was the particular pause she recognized as the one preceding honesty that required a small amount of gathering. "I want the work it would let me do," he said. "The position itself is more administrative than I prefer, but the impact is wider." "Then we go," she said. He looked at her. "Just like that." "Not just like that. I've been watching you develop toward this for 7 years. The administrative questions have been building since the reorganization discussions started. You've been writing letters to Santa Fe about the territorial structure for 2 years. This is the logical progression of what you've been building." She put her hands flat on the table. "The homestead is mine, whatever happens. My name is on the land grant, which I secured specifically so that the land would remain mine regardless of circumstances. We can rent the grazing acreage to Pete Garfield's son, who has been asking about expansion, and keep the homestead structure and the garden under Rosa and Miguel's management with a revenue share. The accounting work can be restructured with a local agent." She paused. "I've been thinking about it for 2 weeks. He looked at her for a long moment. "You said 3 weeks." "I said you had been thinking about it for 3 weeks. I said I had been thinking about it for 2 weeks because I knew 2 weeks ago that you would eventually bring it to the table. You knew before I decided. I've been reading you for 7 years," she said. "The decision was visible. I was waiting for you to see it." He shook his head, not with exasperation but with the specific expression he had when she did something that arrived slightly ahead of his own process, which was something she still found privately satisfying after all this time. "Las Cruces," he said. "Las Cruces," she confirmed. "And I'll start on the necessary correspondence tomorrow." They moved in the autumn of 1889, with James in the wagon demonstrating his father's facility for systematic observation of the landscape and Clara demonstrating her mother's complete self-possession about transitions, and Declan doing as Declan did, which was to proceed with competent stubbornness in the general direction required. Rosa Banulos stood at the foot of the homestead path when they left and held Maude's hands through the wagon window for a long moment. "The spring will be here when you come back," she said. "I know," Maude said. "I'll be back for it." Las Cruces in 1889 was a substantial territorial town, with a proper courthouse and a federal building, and a main street that reflected the commercial growth of a region that the railroad had genuinely transformed. They found a house on a quiet street that had a garden space and a room that could serve as Maude's business office, and the accounting practice transferred into the new context within 3 months, because competence in numbers transferred regardless of geography, and Maude's reputation had preceded her through the network of territorial correspondence that she had been maintaining for years. Charles threw himself into the district supervision work with the energy of a man who had found the right scale for his abilities. He was dealing now not with individual disputes, but with the patterns that produced them, with the structural conditions of land and water and legal access that in the 1870s and 1880s had generated the specific injustices. He had spent his career addressing one case at a time. He was not patient exactly with the political pace of the work, but he was determined, which was more useful. James began attending the Las Cruces school and within a term had consumed all the available books and been redirected toward the territory's small but functioning library. Clara began attending as well when she was old enough and proceeded to attempt to reorganize the other children's approach to learning, which her teacher found both exhausting and effective. Maude had a third child in 1892, a second son, and they named him William Charles Hawkins, which Charles received with the particular quiet expression he had for things that moved him beyond words. William arrived into the household as the most tranquil of the 3 children, disposed toward observation in the manner of his father and toward precision in the manner of his mother, and proceeded through his early years with a contemplative competence that made his siblings, who were both louder and more declarative in their approaches to existence, occasionally stop and look at him with expressions of slight uncertainty about whether he was having more internal experience than was apparent. "He's like you," James told his father once, at the kitchen table in Las Cruces on a winter evening, meaning it as a straightforward observation. "How so?" Charles asked. "He looks at things a long time before he says anything," James said. "And when he does say something, it's usually exactly right." Charles and Maude exchanged a look across the table, and in the look was the accumulated sum of everything that was between them. 12 years of the specific ordinary extraordinary life they had built from a slope and a bucket and 2 plain words. And neither of them said anything, because James's observation was accurate and the moment did not require addition. The homestead on the eastern slope of the basin was visited twice a year, at spring and late summer, when Maude would ride up from Las Cruces with whoever of the children could be brought for the journey and spend several days in the space that was still, legally and essentially, hers. Rosa and Miguel had kept it well. The spring ran clean. The roof held. The garden, managed by Rosa's extended family under the revenue arrangement, was producing with the same focused efficiency it always had. Charles came with her whenever his schedule permitted, which was more often than not. He would stand at the old spring trough sometimes, the way he had stood on the first afternoon she had shown him the water flowing back, and she would stand beside him, and neither of them needed to speak about what it was or what it had been, because the whole history of it was legible in the running water and the slope above, and the two of them present at its edge. In 1893, when James was 10 and Clara was 6 and William was 2, and Maude was 38 and Charles was 47, they rode up to the homestead for the late summer visit and walked the slope in the August morning, which was early enough to be cool and clear enough to see the mountains in the east going from gray to rose to amber in the particular sequence that Maude had tried to describe to her mother in Ohio letters 20 years earlier. James walked ahead, navigating the shale with the competence of a child who had been on this slope since he was old enough to walk. Clara walked beside Maude with the focused observation she brought to everything new she encountered, even the familiar homestead, because she renewed her information about places the way she renewed her information about everything, which was thoroughly and often. William rode on Charles's back in the manner of very small children for whom this was the optimal transport solution, and looked at the mountains going gold. They stood at the top of the slope in the morning light, and the homestead was below them, and the spring was running, and the roof was intact, and the mountains were doing the thing with the light, and Maude looked at all of it from the particular vantage of a woman who had stood on this slope alone with a bucket, who had been taught by this very hill the specific lesson of what she was made of, and who had then had the extraordinary and initially suspicious experience of someone appearing beside her and making a different lesson possible. She took Charles's hand. He held it with the same simplicity with which he had held it at the trough in 1882, no ceremony, just the straightforward fact of it. James asked, from the top of the slope with his characteristic precision, whether they could have breakfast before or after the tour of the property. Clara told him before, obviously, with the tone of someone who found this question unnecessarily complicated. William said, from Charles's shoulder, both. And Maude Prescott Hawkins laughed the real laugh, the involuntary one, and the August morning held it, and the spring kept running below the slope, and the mountains did the thing with the light that nothing in Ohio had ever prepared her for, and everything was exactly, completely, abundantly resolved.